Good evening, everybody. Welcome everyone, both here in the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading and online on YouTube. My name is Luca Chapaliknor, and I work at the University of Liverpool School of Architecture, and I am a landscape architect and art historian by training. This evening's roundtable is a collaboration between IFLA, the International Federation of Landscape Architects, and the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project, IFLA75, Uncovering Hidden Histories in Landscape Architecture, that is led by Imke von Hellemond, Ulrike Fickner, and myself. The project is a networking grant that is using the history of IFLA and the networks and archives of IFLA to bring together landscape researchers, archivists, and practicing landscape architects to learn what we can from the past and the history of IFLA for our future. We are very, very happy to have the opportunity to discuss the legacy of IFLA tonight with all of you. And therefore, without further ado, I'll hand over to our chair, Imke von Hellemond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca, for this introduction. Before we start discussing the issues just raised with our roundtable candidates, I want to introduce them briefly to you. And as I said, I will do it briefly, and certainly will not do them right with my introduction, but it's will be an indication of what they can bring to the table in the teams that are on it. So the first is Tim Waterman. Welcome, Tim. Landscape architect, professor of landscape theory at the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL, and chair of the Landscape Research Group. And of specific interest for us in the project is that the Landscape Research Group, LRG, started itself in the 1950s, if I'm correct. And it's more or less a networking group as IFLA is, so there are some interests and parallels. And which is also interested a lot younger is LEX, the Landscape Exchange website set up recently, which is also of interest in how to present the results of research into network. Then there is Hal Mobridge. Welcome, we're honored to welcome you today here. Thank you. Landscape architect, partner of the office of Colvin and Mobridge. Yes. You also work with Geoffrey Jellicoe. 3 years. For 3 years. And you are the former president of the Landscape Institute and involved in the celebration of its 50th anniversary. And as a president, you have been the representative at IFLA for Great Britain. That's correct. Yes. In fact, I was president long before I dealt with the 50th anniversary. All right. I told you there would be some minor flaws in the introduction, so here's the first one. Then there is on screen Natalia Butler. Welcome, Natalia. Natalia's also a landscape architect. You've been working in Copenhagen and Poland, and of interest is that you research the Polish representative at the first, or not really the first, but the IFLA meeting, the IFLA conference in 1948, which was Alina Schultz. So we're looking forward to hear more from that. Then there is also on screen Charles Birnbaum, CEO and founder of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, well known to many of us, I presume. You have been the coordinator of the National Park Service Historic Landscape Initiative. And of course, what goes for the website of the Landscape Research Group certainly goes for the website of the TCLF with the beautiful presentations of Portraits and People and American landscape architecture. So I think a lot of the networking of, stop for a minute, that was a quick one, thank you. So a lot of the networking of when the archival part and the people who produce archives and people who use archives come together very beautifully. Then there is Ursula Wieser to my right, also landscape architect working at CIFA in Brussels, where she coordinates works at exhibitions and publications. And what is of interest particularly is that the Institute CIFA holds the current IFLA archive since the 1990s, I believe. And then last but certainly not least is Guy Baxter, who leads the archive at the Museum of English Rural Life, who hosts us today. So thank you very much for that. And the Merle holds the archives of the British Landscape Institute, which partly contains IFLA documents as well. So that is the brief introduction. Then I now would like to ask each of you a question. You will see quite introductory questions just to see what knowledge is in the room. And then maybe we can start to explore how we can help each other out and work further also in discovering the networking, the historical networks, particularly of IFLA, but also our own networks nowadays between archivists and archival producers and researchers. So I'd like to start with you, Mr. Morbridge. Right. So one of the essential goals of IFLA, as we understood so far, was to establish international connections between landscape architects and other disciplines. But as a landscape architect with a rather important office and as president of the British Institute, what did you yourself at the time and later experience of that network? So what I mean, it was set as a goal, but did it really happen, so to say?
Well, I think it definitely did. What was interesting for me was it started with a rather European focus, not completely, but North America. I was at the introductory meeting with the gentleman from Chile. I don't remember his name. But then it started with this European focus. Then it spread to the Americas, South and North. And with South America being extremely active, members from all the countries, and now in more recent years, well, maybe decades, it's spread into Asia as well. And I found these connections, all of these connections, absolutely wonderfully stimulating. What I found is that when you meet people from other parts of the world, in a way they have similar problems, but they're different at the same time. So you begin to think about what part of that problem affects you as someone in the UK, and what part of it is just very interesting because it's other countries. And I've been for 20 years a representative of the UK on IFLA, and I've been stimulated in this way throughout that time.
And have you been meeting these people particularly at IFLA events, or also after that and in between?
Usually, particularly at IFLA events.
All right.
Although one or two people I have become friendly with, but almost all of them, it's IFLA events, and then again, so it's a sort of annual meeting. You meet people you know, or wouldn't even know people you know.
Yeah,
that's how it seems.
And then it becomes a reunion every year.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for now. I'd like to go to Natalia, remaining a little bit in the historical IFLA history section or area. From your research into the work of Alina Schultz, what can you say about this network aspect of this this goal or aspiration of IFLA to make international contacts, and how did she perceive that from Poland.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, actually. It was really interesting to get to know how Alina was involved in all the conferences, and to kind of also follow her through the journey, like when she started in England in '48 for the beginning of IFLA meetings, but actually before in the 30s, she was on exchange or studying in England before at Cambridge. So I think it's interesting that she was already a bit settled there, and then she got back to be at more than 10 meetings. Like until 70s, she was as far as the system allowed her, following different IFLA meetings and gatherings. So of course there are different topics, but for me it was really interesting to see the report that she wrote right after the first meeting at IFLA, and she was summarizing how different countries approached the topics, and there was quite substantial differences. Like she was highlighting that, for example, in Sweden or Switzerland, there was a big imprint on the public realm landscapes, and how actually greenery can serve the broader public. Whereas, for example, at that time, specifically France or I think Belgium as well, was presenting more private projects at the exhibition of that time. So she's actually quite in detail discussing who said what at that time, and also giving her personal assessment towards where actually Poland is at the whole broader stage. And it's actually really interesting to get to know that the topics were also really close, landscape and industry, when she's discussing the problems of disguising the different new elements of landscape, but also recreational purposes or even economic aspects of landscape creation. So it's interesting to see that topics that appeared at that time, and that they are actually still valid, and also what she got out of this. And yeah, like her point of view was that actually Poland at that time wasn't so much behind what she summarized in her reports. So I think it's nice to get to know for me.
Thank you. So what we can hear actually, that there is a kind of analogy with what Mr. Mulgrave said, that it's exciting and interesting to hear from others, and not just to open up your world, but also learn about your own position and your own work in your country. That's already rather revealing. Thank you. If I may, Mr. Birnbaum, Charles, may I call you Charles? Thank you. Oh, it's hard to see now, isn't it? Oh, sorry. Quite unelegant. Having set up the Cultural Landscape Foundation and this important product, the website, as I know the website, an important part of it is the overview and the growing overview of projects and persons. Now, I'm a historian myself. I know that has been the way to make and write history for a long time, but now we're looking into networks and connections of people and organizations. Would you see, so this is a kind of hypothetical question, of course, would you see a possibility to expand that or get away a little bit or make that perspective larger?
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying that when I started the Cultural Landscape Foundation in 1997-98 as a Loeb Fellow at Harvard, the web was just coming on the scene. I should also say that by that point, I had co-chaired US ICOMOS's Cultural Landscape Committee and had worked very closely with David Jakes and Peter Goodchild and their counterparts like Ken Taylor in Australia. And so, I was basically in a position that was about setting standards and guidelines for landscapes in a way that they had existed for buildings since the Preservation Act of 1966. But I would say at that time, germane to this question, is there's a real cultural amnesia to those that have shaped the built environment. In the US, more than 10% of the places listed on the National Register were designed by Olmsted and his successor firm. And very few people even realized that there were 3 Olmsteds, there were 2 sons, and Olmsted Sr. did not live from 1822 to 1959, although he did look very tired on a regular basis. But the reality is, I think, there's so much work that needs to be done, not just in the US, but internationally. And I think we would all benefit from a sharing of contextual analysis. When I started CCLF, it was a volunteer gig for 9 years. We built a data dictionary. For those of you unfamiliar with that in the What's Out There database, I would say that it is very American-centric because our history doesn't go back as far in terms of design landscape legacy. So one has to keep that in mind. But 3 years ago, we launched the International Prize in Landscape Architecture with a $100,000 purse named for Cornelia Han Obelander, the great Canadian landscape architect, with the goal of casting a larger net. I'll say one last thing about the US and the UK, just because it's fresh in my mind. I've been doing some training for the Getty's Initiative on Modernism. We're in the middle of an extended online course that's international. And it gave me an opportunity to go back and see some of the things that have developed in the UK over the last 10 years, other than a visit to the Garden Museum to see some of the great collections that are there now, happily, like Russell Page's work and others. But I do think that what's happening in the UK is similar to the US, where we tend to still focus on the great man. We tend, whether it's Jellicoe, whose name came up earlier, whether it's even Dan Kiley, who has been listed, or the architect Sterling. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do at the Cultural Landscape Foundation is cast a larger net for those people that might have been regionally important. We're finding that very often when we produce a digital city guide for a city like we did in St. Louis last year, and we're doing now in Cleveland, Ohio, that many of the names associated with legacies that still stand today, there is absolutely nothing on Google when you do a search whatsoever. Zero. I mean, and once we post even the briefest of bios, 250 to 300 words, that will come up #1 in a Google search. So imagine if you've purchased a home, or there's a community park where you live that was designed by someone. There's a starting point there. There's a kernel associated with it, an organization on which to turn and to begin to build some kind of contextual awareness. And so I think it's absolutely critical to go back to the question. And in particular, as someone that does a lot of guest lecturing at universities, I would say the majority of students across most universities today in America are not from the US. So we are exporting master's students in landscape architecture. And so we have a rich opportunity to cross-pollinate in our sharing of information and knowledge. So I think the more that IFLA can do to begin to bridge build and to begin to share knowledge about how to begin to look at those that have shaped really the discipline of landscape architecture since its origins, the better off we'll be.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to you. So you're nodding heavily, Tim, already. As the hosts, as the representative of the landscape researchers and I'll call you the host of the website for now. As your website, I may be wrong here, but I think it's a little bit more focusing on current activities than history.
Yeah, it's not an archive per se.
No,
yeah.
Exactly. So there's a little bit of a difference. I can imagine that this focusing on persons and the great man, as Charles called it, in current times doesn't work anymore for you. So how?
I think historically, the Landscape Research Group has been primarily interested in networks and bringing people together. And I think what's interesting in how the Landscape Research Group is working in ways that parallel IFLA and the Cultural Landscape Foundation is that it has never fully been an organization that is only about landscape architecture. There's always been a presence of landscape architecture and a presence of design, but we're also open to geographers, anthropologists. And I think what it really represents is the fact that landscape architecture has always needed to open itself up to these interdisciplinary relations, and that the need is there in education for having a very inter and transdisciplinary kind of presence. And in fact, Uniscape issued the Las Palmas Declaration a couple of years ago, which basically said that landscape architecture education cannot happen within structures as they currently exist in universities. So we need to begin to build outwards. So the Landscape Research Group fits this very in-between realm, which I would say definitely is not about the great person, but is about the quality of the networks that have been built. And I would say one last thing I think that's really crucially important now for the direction that landscape research is going in the kind of large sense is that the European Landscape Convention was launched partially with the cooperation of the Landscape Research Group. And that's very much, I think, connects with some of the things that Charles is saying about the need to value local landscapes, and that we find so much value there, and we need to be able to build with those places in mind, and not just the great person, but also not just the most vaunted landscapes. The most ordinary landscapes have to be part of the discussion as well.
A lot of questions come up now. Most of us will agree when the question comes that we are confronting how to do it, but we may come back to that, how to do that in research, how to present that to students, to a larger public, in a not too chaotic way. But first, I'd like to finish my round. Ursula, yes. For SIVA, which is an institute that holds archives and both presents, publishes books and presents exhibitions. What is the relation between the documents in the on landscape architecture, IFLA or others that SIVA holds, and the exhibitions and publications you take care of? Is there a one-on-one relationship? Because we know documents are quite dispersed, they're never in one place. So do you elaborate on that?
Yes, I will. I mean, a lot of what has been said before me resonates a lot, so I'll just bounce back very briefly on what has been said. So just briefly, like SIVA is the Archive Center for Architecture, Landscape Architecture, Town Planning in the broad sense. So already this idea that it's really necessary to collect archives about the built environment in specific centers where researchers can also dive into architects' archives where they might find garden plans, because the landscape architects have worked with an architects and the landscape architects' archives might have been lost, but you find it in a planning permit or something. I think it's really important. And talking about IFLA, I mean, there's different types of archives. There's like archives of archive, what's the term? Producer? Help me. Creators, yes. In French is producer, sorry. Creator, and there's institutional archives. So IFLA has officially entrusted SIVA with institutional archives. So it's really important to also document the history of institutions to sort of see how these networks have worked. So we have the official IFLA archives, which doesn't mean that there's no national IFLA, or back then it was IFLA, now it's IFLA World, IFLA, I mean, it's all very complicated. It's just there's other holdings in other countries, but IFLA has the official, like SIVA has the official IFLA archives. And the way we work, also talking about great men, because as it happens, it's often men, we only collect archives in Belgium territory, which is the role of an archive center normally. And we do a lot of research in-house on lesser known figures. So our mission is really to put light onto figures that are normally not in sort of official histories or garden history and stuff. So this is our role. And how does that relate to IFLA? Well, everything is at some point connected. And I mean, when this project started, we just had an exhibition on a lesser known of Belgian landscape, lesser known figure. It was called Jules Buysens. As it turns out, he was at the end of his life also in the first meetings of IFLA. René Becher was, of course, one of the founding members, one of the driving forces between IFLA, ICOMOS, IFLA, and all these things. And the more we look into it and the more we exchange with the different partners in this HRC project, the more we see the connections, and this is really where the work needs to be done.
That was a great exhibition too.
Did you see it?
I saw it, it was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
All right, thank you, Ursula. Now, Guy, knowing that documents are dispersed and knowing that we need for historical research and presentation, we need the creators and the archivists and the researchers. This is a rather, well, hypothetical or maybe wishful thinking, however you want to interpret it, but what would you think the ideal roles would be? What would be a way to connect people? Is it just loosely for each project, or would it be good to have a kind of basic infrastructure for it? Or
yeah, thanks, Inka. I mean, I am in some ways the interloper in the room, not being a landscape architect, but I know, for shame on me. But that does allow me to some extent to sort of observe a little of some of how these things have come about. And actually, I should say that as someone who, to an extent, the decision about 10 years ago by our museum to take important landscape, start taking important UK landscape archives was a big decision, but it was been a really fruitful one in terms of the people I've met and the connections we've made and the research we've been able to help to drive and the teaching we've been able to help to drive and the public engagement we've been able to help to drive. I think what I suppose I've learned from this is that as with many of these things, archives are always going to be diasporic in their nature. That is how it is. I write a letter, or Jules Buysens writes a letter to René Becher, and René Becher has part of Buysens' archive, and then he writes back, and then the opposite happens. So we're always having this spreading out. And once people start communicating internationally, those archives are naturally, and those materials, those source materials are going to end up globally dispersed. The infrastructures that we use to preserve archives are naturally always going to end up being nationally based. That's almost inevitable, or institutions that are, those institutions have a primary sort of national basis. That's often going to happen. So how do we overcome that? And I think we overcome that through the sorts of things that Charles and others have been doing in terms of getting the data out there and starting to allow people to make connections. And only the web can really allow us to do that. So we need our electronic resources to enable us to do that. And I think we all need to believe in publishing as much as we can, and doing so openly, and thinking about sharing our data and thinking about the quality of our data and making sure that those things can happen. The other barrier, I suspect, is I think the disciplinary boundaries that we set ourselves. That again, our structures set ourselves silos in terms of discipline, in terms of curator and archivist and researcher and teacher, and sometimes there's some we think that perhaps the wider research community doesn't have much volunteers, or people who just have an interest. Charles, you mentioned people who have an interest in their local landscape. Those people are users of our information. They're also massive potential contributors to our information. Who knows their local park better than the people who use it and have perhaps been using it for generations. So that engagement with a wider research community, engagement that crosses over our disciplinary boundaries as well as our international boundaries, I think that's crucial, taking that attitude into our work. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Well, thank you. I think it's
Can I just jump in here because I can't
sure.
resist.
Come in.
No, because I think I opens the door on it. I think something that's very critical that we often don't think about, which is, although we may even have an archive, how do people find it? And, you know, I think one of the things that we're witnessing here, and I can say this because if you get our biweekly e-letters, for example, I will tell you when those go out every other Tuesday at 10 a.m., you know, I'm in Google Analytics in real time. I'm looking at the reports the next day, because we want to be very careful that we're providing our consumers, if you will, our readers, with information they're interested in. It's not about us, it's about our audience. And so, you know, I would just say as a prelude to this, that we look at everything as 3 steps: make visible, instill value, engage. So let's take it at face value, the idea of make visible. So if I go into Google, which I did moments ago, and I type in Jeffrey Jellicoe archive, there are myriad sources that will come up for me at the top of the list, because those organizations have a footprint that will cast a shadow. That means they're not crowded out in a Google search. But the reality is, the majority of the time, because of paid advertising and the softness of footprints of a lot of the organizations, you don't find these easily. And so I think part of this also is not just thinking about what do we do to conserve the work, what do we do to make it visible, but how do we ensure that people can find it? And I think that, you know, this is something here in the US, for example, if the National Endowment for the Arts gives funding, it is for the artistic work. It is not for sort of the metrics of increasing of Google footprint. And so we don't have funding sources at a national level, unless you're a very sophisticated grant writer and going after a National Science Foundation grant. Most arts and cultural organizations will not fund that. And so I think that's the other piece of this is to go back to the initial question, is if you bring a variety of countries and NGOs and academic institutions, how do we become a critical mass to cast a larger shadow so that we can be found in Google searches? And I think that's just something we shouldn't lose sight of. If you build it, they will come.
That sounds very promising, thank you. Is there somebody who wants to react?
I would like, if I may, just
Yeah, sure.
to come back on what Charles said there, because I think what we can do as institutions, because we have the knowledge and we have the ability to understand and interpret the knowledge, is we therefore have a responsibility to not gatekeep that knowledge, which has been the traditional way. I know something and I'm going to therefore, that gives me an advantage and I'm going to guard that information. But now with the technology that's at our fingerprints and with the need to, with a need to put those stories, those well, the title indeed of this project is Hidden Histories. Those hidden histories to the forefront, we need to make sure that we are sharing, and that what we're sharing is authoritative data in the sense that it's based on a source that we can recognize. So it's coming from an archive or from a published article or something that we trust that we've got to. Now that may change over time, and we know that interpretation of items and new material is discovered all the time. We've been looking at some archival material today that either relates directly to the history of IFLA or that perhaps touches on things that we've spoken about in our sessions. And some of that I've never seen before, even though it's in my archive. So there's always new things, always new ideas coming forward, and we need to reflect that. But I think it is that ability to say, well, actually, we can counter all the, let's be honest, rubbish that's out there on the internet that's going to be not just getting ahead of us on the Google searches, but giving people the wrong information. giving people the information that's not been researched and not been, so those of us who are doing things in a way which is rigorous in terms of our research, we have an obligation, I think, at least to share the metadata that we build up about that and some of those the elements of that knowledge.
Thank you. I think a lot of doors have been opened up now. First of all, being aware of what the archive consists of, because we've been talking in a quite limited way initially on archives like documents, mostly paper documents. In our project, we do it on purpose because we go entirely crazy if we have to look for digitized documents and other ones. But of course, we know that, as Charles mentioned, well, the internet started to grow and come up in the 1990s. So there is 30 years of history already. But maybe for the sake of argument, it's better to not go into that difficult question, how to deal with that, because, well, we've known that archivists don't know yet. So, but having said that, apart from a paper trace, there is, of course, the trace of memory, the living histories, as we call it, from the users of design landscapes, but also, if I may look at you, you have such a long history, histories that can be recorded in audio files. And so I think there are two things. We sound all, or people that have spoken so far, including me, so I'm very enthusiastic on opening up and do a more integrated or connected history. But historiographically, that's the question, how do you manage that? It's like a geographer wanting to make a one-on-one map, I sometimes think. You know, you want to include everything. So there's still the direction of a selection, so how could we do it? So speaking to you today already is building an archive, I think, while we're still there. Just let me be clear, I'm not calling you an archive. I'm honoured and proud to be next to you.
I did once, I believe, how I did once refer to you as a natural archivist.
So I wanted to stress that paper traces, but also audio and video files and photography are still quite traditional documents, but also speaking to people, knowing that your memory will have evolved since you started. Yeah.
I was interested in the points made about people who are not famous people. Today I was looking in the archive here at Jeffrey Jellicoe's material, but I came across an interesting little thing about Judith Lederbach. Now, Judith Lederbach was a very active person. I don't honestly know very much what she did. And is there a way in archives, so if you were interested in her, you could find out what the archive here had about her? And that's a question which would be very helpful to people who are searching for information about other people.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention it, because in Dutch we would say Lederboer, so I think she has a Dutch origin, and we came across her. Yeah, actually we came across her, she lectured in the Netherlands. Right. So I think what happens here already is very good in terms of connection, that we share memories and findings. Yes. But then I think how to look for directions to do that. Ursula.
Yeah, if I may react, I mean, on the question of who's famous and who's not famous, of course, there's very talented landscape architects, but there's also very good communicators. And often it's a combination of a good communicator and mostly talented landscape architect, but some super talented landscape architects are very bad communicators. And second point is also who's writing history. And again, like we have to question why big figures are big figures. They're not always big figures because they're the most interesting of their period. Sometimes it's just who's written the history, maybe their own interest. And sometimes I'm just thinking of René Pecher. They started building their own history and they are thinking about the legacy and they create their own archives. So you really have to question the reason why some archives are more famous and some landscape architects are even more famous. So as landscape historians, we have to really kind of dig into all this questioning why this happens, this dynamics.
Broaden up. Yeah.
And that's why it's really important to collect very broadly, because sometimes you find gems in totally unexpected places, totally unexpected. And, you know, just focusing on what we think is important, it's because we've read it in a book that we know it's important. But if we're not going to dig somewhere else, we're not going to put forward the ones that we don't know yet that they're.
That's confirming what's there already. By the way, it's also that some historians make people famous.
Yes.
Sometimes against their will. So there, we need to read
history is complicated
with the historiography. I thought, Charlotte, you raised your hand.
Yeah, yes. Well, you had asked initially about oral histories, and it's something that I don't know if people are familiar with our oral history program at the foundation. We've just unveiled one with Julie Bargman. But I think, you know, what's so interesting is that, you know, people are going to consume this information in different ways. Scholars will have the benefit of a transcript reading in the first person's words, you know, in an unvarnished fashion that you might get from a landscape historian. But I think what we've also found is that by dispensing these clips in 2 to 5 minute segments, I mean, the Julie Bargman one we've just completed is 105 minutes, and it's about 28 clips. So if you're going to a landscape that Bargman designed, you could actually hear on site when you're there, Julie describing that design process or the client or or the story behind it. And so I think that there's a real benefit to it. But I think one of the, and I agree with the comment that you don't necessarily want to do a rich production for someone that's not a good storyteller and is better left to reading as a transcript, because these projects are expensive to do. I mean, one of the challenges we have in the US is if you're not a big name, being able to secure the funding. But the last thing I just want to say about this is things don't have to be richly produced anymore. You can do a seated conversation on, you know, Zoom, export it, and then have a permanent record. But I think there's something really powerful about hearing from the person in the first person about the work. And I think it would be great to see more and more of that.
Thank you. So I think if I may summarize a little bit what has been said so far, is that we're going into a direction, or we like to go there, to open up collecting histories and documents in all kinds of shapes and ways. But suppose we manage to do that and get other accents and not just focus on these persons and projects that are repeated over and over again. Suppose we get that together like we're trying to do in this project. How would we be able to present that? Because presenting specific, more or less limited oeuvres or lives of people and projects is doable. But how are we going to present their connections, their interactions, their developments and interaction between countries, between organizations? So how, you understand there is no answer to it, it's kind of speculative, but we're here to explore this possibility. So maybe do we have an idea?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because you can't get away from the question of the digital, because that is so fundamental to the way that we network with one another.
Yeah.
So making those networks durable and visible in some way, I think, is part of what Charles is pointing to. But the fragility of these networks, especially the ones that are centrally administered, is something that's become all too apparent, for example, in the apparent falling apart of Twitter, which has been such an important networking tool for so many of us, academics and professionals. And to think, you know, I've spent, for example, a decade building that community there, and then some guy just comes along, you know, some idiot comes along and is able to just break it. So I think looking at places on the internet where information is durable is really important for maintaining history and maintaining those networks. So making sure that associations are visible, like for example, with the Nouveau Pittoresque, which was a really interesting group in Belgium at that particular time. And I would say one of the best places to start would be Wikipedia.
Yes, yes, I agree.
You think it will last, Wikipedia?
I think Wikipedia will last. Yeah, yeah. It's open source, crowdsourced, verified by a number of people who are really invested in it, and with a constant kind of turnover of people that are maintaining it. So I would say the most important thing to make sure that we do is to make sure that our histories are on Wikipedia, and not just the histories of the great and the good, but the history of those small local groups, and to make sure that they're linked like crazy so that those are durable and they don't get knocked off. Also the voices of women, because so feminist Wikipedia editing is a really, really important project. Queer voices, all of those, you know.
Yeah.
So I can't stress that enough. But I also think that we kind of need to maybe start to work with programmers and try to figure out the algorithms that we need to be able to search the internet in ways that are fruitful.
Yeah.
To look for associations instead of individuals, to look for networks instead of great projects, you know, those kinds of things. Those are questions we can ask with algorithms, and those are perhaps questions that we can ask with AI.
Yeah, and it would be maybe more easy to get money for than people.
Yeah, I mean, the lure of
Yeah.
the digital, you just put that, you know, tack that on, and all of a sudden funding arrives.
The only thing is, we need to make a good backup for these lemmas on Wikipedia, because just if the next crazy person comes along and presses a button, it's all gone.
I don't think
That's the
anyone
other
can
side.
buy Wikipedia.
Yeah.
That's the good thing.
That's the good thing.
Electricity fallout.
Electricity
Yes.
fallout, that will be the next thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of which, Natalia, would you know if there is a lemma on Alina Schultz on Wikipedia?
Yeah, there is actually, but I'm not entirely sure who is the author. I was even trying to contact at some point, but I didn't get through. I mean, I'm also not like a trained scholar, so our ways of searching was also, I think it's interesting because to some degree I contacted some of you. I contacted actually Hall Morich and the archive of Merle looking for Alina. I actually contacted Luca as well, because thinking how I kind of got to the archives, not knowing about them, because, you know, I was more like the project that we've done, it was a self-initiated project that was actually a multidisciplinary team of art historians, architects, and me as landscape architect working on Alina. And then we managed to get through to the Warsaw Museum that actually organized the exhibition, and later we also published the book about the Alina. So, but it's only in Polish, right? And we tried to actually also get to the, you know, more international archives, as we knew that there is a connection to IFLA, and we could see a lot of similarities in, let's say, you know, Brenda Colvin's and Sylvia Kerr CVs, and we wanted to do that, but at that time, it was actually COVID time, and we had some difficulties to travel ourselves, for example, to Brussels, to the archive. We tried to contact via emails. We got some information from some people, but you know, it wasn't that easy actually for us to get the more international context of Alina's work at that time. But we still gathered some information back home that was also really dispersed in different archives, but also like, for example, we got to see the Alina's correspondence with René Pecher, because that was a part of the security, the Polish security service that was actually spying on Alina, being the, you know, agent for, I don't know for whom, but it never got confirmed how, but she was actually spied for 20 years, and her correspondence was read it, and we could have some insight in what she was writing, you know, greeting wife, you know, like pretty personal things. So you know, like the ways of us kind of screening through the archives make me think on how to make it visible. And to me, like, okay, I'm a landscape architect, so I know about some events within landscape architecture world, but if you're architect, you're a bit out of this bubble. So, and the same about art historian, when they've been interested in promoting the field of landscape architecture, it was yet another searches that they've been pushing. So it was actually pretty interesting to network within different disciplines, and I think that was pretty strong that we weren't only landscape architects with the same kind of focus on the areas that we've been searching.
Thank you. It's very revealing. So it would really help to look at Wikipedia. It's a good tip. Thank you.
Everyone should become an editor.
Yeah, because you can cross-link, of course. So that's, I think that's the tip of the day. I have a brief other question to you, which is, as you said, the landscape research group was always very interdisciplinary, and that was really a setup for IFLA from the beginning as well. So we've been speaking about languages, so there could be two different bumps in the road for connecting to each other regarding language. First, literally, because you don't understand each other, read each other's pieces. And secondly, because people from different disciplines sometimes speak different languages about the landscape. So you have quite some experience. Well, at least the organization has quite some experience with that. How do you deal with that?
Well, the history of the Landscape Research Group is interesting in that it has become much more international than it once was.
Yeah.
So when it started, it was largely based in the UK, and then gradually became more European, and then gradually became more international. And what we really experienced during the lockdown is that all of a sudden, because of Zoom and Teams and all of these platforms for communicating effectively, we kind of blossomed in terms of our international engagement. Language is an interesting one because, of course, Landschaft, landscape, paysage, you know, all have different meanings and different valences.
Yeah.
But I do think, and I don't say this as a kind of English language supremacist, but some of the work that's been done in recent years, excavating the word landscape for its meanings, work that's been done, you know, by Dennis Cosgrove and Stephen Daniels and Kenneth Olwig. There's really been an explosion of knowledge in landscape and a shifting meaning of that term.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a gift because English has become such a universal language that the richer that word is and the more meaning is held there. And that includes kind of contradictions too, because landscape is at once a kind of scenographic representation that has arrived from art history to become scenery, but it is also a relationship between people and place that is mutually constitutive. It is both of those things. They're in conflict, but they also somehow manage to hang together in ways that are really meaningful. Speaking about the Landscape Research Group, I think when it began, there was much more openness in academia and in research to the kind of research that landscape architects do, which would be much more important to an organization like IFLA. But because academic publishing has become a much more kind of rarefied zone, that type of research has almost disappeared out of academic publishing entirely. the sort of site-based, project-based kind of research. So you spoke a little bit earlier about LEX, about the Landscape Exchange, and that, because it's a digital platform, we're kind of hoping that can become a place that can hold some of that research that's not quite peer-reviewed, and also that we can open up into lay research, which actually connects to Wikipedia quite a bit as well, because anyone can edit Wikipedia, anyone can be an expert.
Yeah.
So I think these are challenges for what kind of work is documented. You know, it can't just all be peer-reviewed academic publications. We need much more than that to document the work that we do.
If I could just come in on that, I think one of the things that I've observed very much about landscape architects, and don't worry, anyone listening, it's going to be a very positive comment about landscape architects, is that already landscape architects are very open to interdisciplinary exchange of ideas and of views. They work in many ways at the boundaries of perhaps disciplines that are around building the environment, or the built environment or the natural environment, that perhaps have people who have been doing perhaps those set roles for longer. And in some ways, landscape architecture, in some ways, certainly as a profession, has been a slightly a disruptor of that, and therefore has had to place itself to an extent in opposition to those things. And by placing itself in opposition, it's also had to place itself in a situation where it has to find a way to work with the architect and work with the engineer and work with the person who's managing the landscape and the landowner and all those, and of course the people who are using the landscape, the public as the public users or the private users as well. And I think therefore naturally I found it very positive working with landscape architects and people involved in landscape management and so on, because of that openness to disciplines. And I think what we've done in the network that we're part of, the Network of European Landscape Archives, has been very interesting, because practically the first thing I learned was that the people who were very much coming from landscape, either from a design point of view or a research point of view, wanted to know what the archivists do. And myself and some of my colleagues in the room, including Hannah Sauter from Versailles, have been as well, have been working very much on some work which was very much about mutual understanding between what the archive is and what the archivist does to shape that, and also and what the researchers and the landscape architects understand of that. That's been a very useful piece of work. Alongside that has been a piece of work where we've been looking at archival terms across multiple languages. So getting a kind of an international glossary around those terms. So when we refer to these kinds of technical things that we sometimes say, we're not creating an additional linguistic barrier with our jargon and multiple languages as well. But I think even then, even within the field of what we've been doing there is a challenge, I think, to those who are involved in caring for the archives. It's one that I feel very much here, that we have to ensure that we're doing the same thing. We're breaking outside of our disciplinary boundaries. Very, very lucky here because we work very closely with library colleagues, and libraries have a very, very strong and long history of publishing data, for instance, of publishing metadata and having computerized cataloging, and with museum colleagues who have a very long tradition of public engagement and putting the visitor first and thinking about our audiences and the barriers to their access to knowledge. So putting those two things and plugging those two things into archives has actually been incredibly powerful. But I think actually the lesson that comes from landscape architecture for us is that those engagements are tremendously productive. They're tremendously productive. They're not threatening. They are empowering.
Thank you. I'm glad you raised the multilingual issue again, because I'd like to go into it a little deeper. How was that for you, working so long or connecting to people at IFLA conferences? Because obviously I don't know what languages you or speak, but was it easy to connect to people? Did everybody have a command of English, for instance, at the
I'm
time?
ashamed to say I only speak English. And I think the honest truth was that most of the people who attended, as representatives of different countries, did speak English. And there were a few people who needed translation. And to begin with, they had to pay translators to deal with translation. But it turned out that rather few people needed that. And I remember there was one event where there was one person, I think, who spoke only French, and the Canadian representative acted as translator for that person during the meeting, being bilingual. But everyone else spoke English. So personally, I'm a bit feeble. I only speak English, but that seemed to be the international language for the IFLA meetings. And I particularly think about Martha Fajardo, who I greatly admire as one of the presidents of IFLA, who I think did a great deal to open up IFLA, from Colombia, a Spanish speaker, but she spoke English fluently.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I ask it because I noticed in the last 2 years, both in education, where I work myself, but in research, but also at the Journal of Landscape Architecture, where I was in the editorial team, that more often questions were raised about the English as the more, so to say, dominant language, because like focusing on specific people, other languages and ideas from people who do not have command of English may disappear out of sight. That's why I wanted to focus on language. And I know that some people from France, for instance, and they bring an entirely other understanding of landscape and cultural history of landscape. So I just want to be prudent, say everybody speaks English. That think, okay, then you will indeed just speak to the people who do speak English, and the other one, well, so I see people nodding. Maybe somebody will like get into that. So it's a surprise to me that everybody had command of English at the IFLA, because IFLA published bilingual French and English, and it was raised once in a while if they should add more languages.
So they should add Spanish for sure, and I suspect Chinese.
Yeah, maybe.
But
So I think we should keep that in our mind. So what about you, coming from Belgium, being automatically bilingual?
Well, my mother was an interpreter at the European Commission, and there was a time when there was lots of interpreters, but you know, it tends to now get narrowed down to a couple of languages, and I think it brings up also the question of precision of language. And we spoke about the glossary of archival terms, which was a really important tool for us to set up, because there can be so many misunderstandings and so much imprecision in talking about things which are not defined precisely. And I think, I mean, it's just a hypothesis, like what might be happening with English, with people that have a sufficient command of English, but not a very good command, is that the precision of analysis and the precision of formulating ideas goes down. So, again, we are into budget question, who pays for a good translator? That's always the question. And a good translator is a person that can write. It's a literary person. It's not Google Translate, unfortunately. So it's always a money question.
Yeah.
A good translator costs a lot of money.
And it's a person.
And it's a real person.
There's maybe a flip side to this though too, and it has to do with international practice. And at one point it was English, European, and American practices that had the upper hand. But I think now that everyone has a common language, there's much less possibility for the kind of center of power to remain in the UK and the United States, that because everyone speaks English and because everyone can participate, I think we're going to be seeing some remarkable new practices out of China, especially where landscape architecture is booming. So that might be hard, I think, for the kind of core Anglophone nations to hear, but I think the power base will shift.
I mean, on the flip side again, I mean, I've had to research some documents in Russian because Persons was in Russia at some point. I mean, I was very happy that DeepL helped me to understand. So I just put it in the translator and I thought, great, I understand it. So, I mean, it's a great opportunity, but it's. Yeah.
But if you don't know Russian, you need to know that the translator is translating well. But that's another discussion. Yeah. And maybe, Natalia, do you have to add something to this coming from Poland? I don't know if English was automatically the language for you to go to.
Yeah, I mean, I was for a longer time in Copenhagen, so that wasn't, yeah, the English wasn't a barrier as you talked. I don't think the barrier for me was more like that. Yeah, I mean, as I said, like I didn't know where to look for. I mean, Wikipedia is an easy go to. I also use some, ResearchGate or like. Then I got to know about the GSTOR or like so it was more about the place that the language wasn't really a problem. Then there was another thing, actually the name Alina Scholz, which some of the researchers maybe even considered to research, but they thought she's German because of the, like back in family, there were some German relatives, and then also a lot of different variations of her name, and she was actually using her miss in Polish. When you have the surname and you are Mrs. because she wasn't married for most of her life, she was adding some ending, and then there was at least 20 different versions, like with of how people wrote her name and surname, and like so that was the barrier, because like also she was using some Polish sign in her surname. So looking even in Modern Gardens, Tunard book, it was written with some mistake, and like so it was more about just looking for the multiple ways and where to find the
especially knowing what you do not know. Yeah.
Yeah, so.
All right. I think we've covered quite some ground. I don't know if one of the people at the round table want to raise some issues that we did not address. Yes.
We've talked about different languages, but there's also different cultures and ways of behaving. And if I can come again to Marta Fayada, she's a very outgoing person. When she received her honorary degree at Sheffield, she was taught at Sheffield, she got an honorary degree. After she was given the degree, she kissed the vice chancellor. Now, this was unknown. I mean, in English universities, it's all very formal, and you've got to behave formally. And it was very popular to the students, but it was an extraordinary thing. She could do it, but some people might try to do it very naturally, and it would be mistaken what it was. So there's this cultural difficulty between different cultures. And that's perhaps also for African cultures, are very different to our own. And so the people who come from African countries, sometimes we don't quite communicate with them.
Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, it's a non-lingual way of communicating that we should look into. Yeah, quite important.
Yeah, I just would add, we're having this conversation about language, but I think the elephant in the room is the term landscape architect. We're all taking for granted that this is a universal as a starting point of this conversation. This is a conversation, we began our conversation today talking about multidisciplinary approaches to our own discipline. And, for example, in Spain, that term is not understood. And then you begin to talk about Africa and India. So if a person's dealing with hydrology or wilding, is that landscape architecture? And so the other piece of this, as we look at broadening our coalition for this conversation, what do we do in these places that don't recognize the terminology to begin with as a starting point?
Thank you. So actually, we're back to the beginning. Because
Sadly.
discussions from the 1973, what are we and who are we? We do it all over again. That's our fate.
There's an international federation called International Federation of Landscape Architects. So shouldn't we take that sort of overarching term as a sort of assembly term?
Yeah, it's a kind of reference, not for a kind of limiting the field.
It's difficult for those, you know, we're talking about histories and about these kind of complex connections, but you know, our starting point for all of these things has been about precision of language and if the starting point is as it is in many archives is a pile of paper documents, or I know we're not supposed to talk about it in INCA, but a hard disk drive filled with data of some person, then those initial labelings are crucial. Eventually some decisions have to be made in order to get us from that kind of chaotic position into one which has meaningful language, so that someone can start to think about writing a Wikipedia article or doing the things we need to do. I think we're always struggling with that, aren't we? We're always struggling in archives between the truth that what we have in front of us is probably infinitely complex, and the fact that we have to stick these kind of labels. We have to start sticking labels on it, and we have to start putting some kind of order on it, or no one is going to be able to access it. And I think that kind of comes very much to the heart of where archive professions are. But I do agree with you, Charles, that narrowing for instance, our collecting focus in a way that says, oh, I only do landscape architecture is one. I mean, I'm very lucky. We look at a much broader sense than that. So, you know, actually, that explains why the Museum of English Rural Life was able to take a lot of material that was about landscape architects working in urban, on greening and urban environments. We were able to flex our understanding. I think that's important that you're also able to say, well, actually, I know this is on the edge. I know this is on the edge of what linguistically you might understand my institution to be about. However, in terms of meaning, in terms of what it actually is, in terms of what the archive is telling us, is going to tell our audience, is going to tell future audiences, this is important, and we need to be inclusive of it.
Thank you. Are there, I think we are going slowly to work our way toward ending this session. But I can feel some vibrations.
And then I'll come after. I can hear you.
Yeah. I'll maybe just bounce back on the topic of academic writing and the connection between academia and knowledgeable people and getting knowledge out there in the world. Because, I mean, I think it's really a question of communication. Landscape architecture already lacks visibility in a really, really serious manner. So to me, using the terminology landscape or architect is not only a question of, maybe we're going to sort of philosophically think it in front. It's also a matter of communication. And coming back to Wikipedia, I think it's really important that academics also learn to write like in non-academic language in places that are not addressing academics, like in exhibitions and for a large audience, because in order to get visibility, we have to address everyone. And so to be on the net in cultural places, not amongst academics, because if academics speak to academics, it's just a loop, you know, and of course this is really important, but it needs to seep out and the language needs to be accessible to a large audience.
Yeah, so to ensure write in an authoritative, reliable way,
yes,
but also readable for everybody.
It's serious research knowledge, but it's made accessible, and that's why Wikipedia it's a perfect tool for making this knowledge accessible, but it's super researched
and the example I have in mind really connects to that, because I'm a huge fan of Jane Wolfe's work, and I've worked with Jane. She's at the University of Toronto, and she's a beautiful book which is called Bay Lexicon, and it teaches people from the San Francisco Bay Area what their landscape is, what its components are, and what those components are called. So her mission is, by using drawings and language, very clear, plain English language, her mission is to empower people to speak of and for their landscape and to understand it as a landscape. And that, I think, really connects to what Charles is saying about, landscape architecture is the elephant in the room. And I've been part of this discussion as long as I've been a landscape architect. And I honestly think that people don't have any trouble with the word architect. They understand that that has something to do with plans and sections and drawings and, someone who wears round eyeglasses. But they don't understand landscape. And that's the thing I think that we can give as a gift to people, is to just explain the richness of landscape and then help people to see the places they live as landscapes that they can speak of and for in the way that Jane Wolfe encourages us to do. So that's the power word. That is the word that drives us, and that is the word that we need to give as a gift to people to explain their existences in the places they live.
I think, Charles, you want to respond to that?
Well, I do, because, we're dogged here at the Cultural Landscape Foundation about when landscape architects are called other things like architects. And I want, to me, the other sort of, if the term landscape architecture as a universal was the elephant in the room, I would say the baby elephant for me traveling alongside is that there's a very thin line between education and advocacy. And, one of the things that we've learned here, I can only speak to the US, but young professionals that are studying today, they want to understand what an activist practice looks like, and they want to be able to advocate. And that to advocate is to empower. It is a way to deploy knowledge. And I would just encourage everyone that whenever they see a landscape architect called something else, they have to write, they have to take a position. We have recently been told by a senior editor who called our laureate an architect in a headline, even after getting a letter sent by Beth Meyer, who was the dean at UVA, explaining the difference. They referred to it, I'm paraphrasing here, as a quaint idea once. And then they were also said, well, and this is a direct quote, everyone knows that landscape architecture is a subset of architecture. Now, this is a high-level editor at the New York Times who will remain nameless because this is being recorded. But this happens all the time. And I just have to say that we have to be dogged about it.
But I have one question. Wasn't it the case that in the 60s at Berkeley, the dean of all faculties, including architecture, was a landscape architect on top of the... I've been told that. So what's happened since the 60s? Are we going backwards?
No, I think we have many people. Dorothea Imbert is the current dean at Ohio State, and, she is a landscape architect. So, I think we've, in academia, we're seeing a wonderful blurring of those lines and an elevation of landscape architecture in schools of architecture. But I think when it comes to the media, especially things like the New York Times and the Washington Post, it's important, if it's the Guardian, that if a landscape architect is called something else, that we call them out on it. So, because it's an opportunity, again, to educate and advocate.
Thank you. I think that message is clear, good writing and being out there. So is there somebody from the panel wanting to add something to the conversation? Yeah, I was working my way toward it, but I wanted to close our panel discussion for now. So before we go to the brief notes or conclusions or that Ulrike will present us, we have little time, a bit time for urgent questions and remarks. I think Nick, as the representative of IFLA in this first workshop, you raised your hand?
Yes, not directly as a representative of IFLA, but more a personal remark following the remarks before about landscape architecture, landscape and advocacy, etc. in the Netherlands and many other countries that undersigned and ratified the European Landscape Convention, we as citizens, but especially as our discipline, we are enforced and encouraged to help the people to understand what landscape is, because they have a right to landscape. So by law, the European citizens and all that undersigned the convention have a right to landscape, and to exercise that right, you need to have conscience and understanding of the concept of landscape. So in education on all levels, and especially those disciplines like geography, landscape architecture, landscape ecologists, they have to work on that because we are forced to. We want to, but we are underpowered by this international law.
We're forced by law, so to say, yeah, to educate and advocate. Yeah. Is there somebody else who wanted to join and ask some question?
Okay. When we tried to, I worked for the government in the Netherlands, and when we tried to get ratified the European Landscape Convention, our highest controller of law, if it's according to the constitution, etc., they wrote back to us when we tried to bring in the law. So when we understand it well, this word of landscape, it means that it's about everything. But okay, now I understand that they are very smart, and they said it's about everything, and even more, it's also about something in the mind. So they really good understood what the Landscape Convention was about. It's not just about a thing out there, but it's about what happens in the body and the mind and the relation between it. So I was really flabbergasted that some law people write us back and they try to understand what it is, and they had exactly the right understanding of the definition.
There you're learning with landscape architects like the Dutch landscape architect Dirk Simons, who always propagates landscape is everything. So I think that's the best conclusion of discussion we can have, more or less. Landscape is everything, body and mind and space and law and understanding and right and will. So if there are no urgent matters or opinions, then maybe Ulrike, may I give you the
just for the concluding statement.
Yeah, just you listened critically to what we said, so maybe you can mention the elephants.
And other species, maybe.
And other species, yeah.
First of all, I want to thank everyone at this round table for this very inspiring exchange. And I think it has clearly shown that networking within it and across the sphere is crucial when it comes to designing and managing our built environment, one point, and when it comes to archives of landscape architecture as well. That's what, like, this experience Guy was addressing. We have this or exchange within a network of European landscape architecture archives. And I think that just stood out very few points I wrote down. So I think this question, how we engage with our audience, which is really a wide one, because everyone is like living in our built environment, how we are engaged with them, and how can we integrate them, their knowledge, their experience in developing our discipline field, and how can we ensure that the audience is finding our information. So it's a lot about communicating, and we had this at least this different brilliant home pages, web pages like Cultural Landscape Foundation and Team Europe homepage as well. So, and then there is, of course, this duty, responsibility of sharing information. It's connected to these web pages. What information do we share with them? How do we collect it? Do we respect minorities, differences, cultural differences? And cultural differences also, like, which are inspiring our approach to everything, to design, to research. Yeah. What else do I write down? Somehow we have this look back of how the question of how we can integrate or make visible not only the great landscape architects, but also those who are of local landscape architects. So then we came back, like if we look more about on networks and groups, maybe to discuss these. So and of course, with all these discussions, it's like always crucial the relation to landscape. So I think that's more or less. I think that when we started to file in this application, it was a crucial point was the 75th anniversary of IFLA, and I think it's like a very good point to explore the past, then to engage or to reflect on how we shape the present and to envision the future. So it is something we take on with us, or we deal with every day. And this was only the second of 4 workshops within this HR French project. So we will continue to explore the topic to foster the bond between architects, landscape architects, professional students, society. And yeah.
And just to add to that, that it was the first webinar of the IFLA75 sessions, and the next one is going to be about education. So everyone stay tuned for the IFLA news for the coming up webinar about education and discussing how we can educate landscape architects, which is going to be welcome.
Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you, IFLA, for hosting us. Thank you, audience, for listening. Thank you, of course, people at the table. I'm always thinking of the allies at the table of Jennifer again in one of the IFLA conference booths. It's just such a nice idea sitting at the table and sharing. So both online and on site. So hopefully we can join somehow, somewhere, somewhen, remembering that landscape is everything, including the history and the future. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you for